When John Mellencamp recently reflected on the changing music industry, he shared a story that immediately grabbed attention. According to him, one major change in the early 1990s permanently altered the future of rock music. Some listeners viewed his explanation as an honest insider account, while others felt it sounded almost like a conspiracy theory. Either way, his comments sparked an interesting conversation about how music charts, radio stations, and record labels shaped the careers of countless artists. Mellencamp explained that throughout his career he learned valuable lessons from critics and music journalists. One of the people he respected most was Tim White, a close friend who served as editor of both Rolling Stone and Billboard. The two reportedly spoke almost every day, despite having very different personalities. Mellencamp described Tim as someone who always dressed neatly with a bow tie, blue jeans, and a jacket, while bringing a professional perspective to every conversation. One day, Tim called him with news that seemed routine at first, but would later prove incredibly significant. He explained that Billboard was preparing to make a deal with a company called SoundScan. At the time, Mellencamp admitted he had never heard of it and had no idea why it mattered. When he asked what SoundScan actually was, Tim gave him a surprising warning. He believed this agreement would dramatically reshape the music business and could even hurt artists like Mellencamp. Naturally, John wanted to know why. Tim explained that before SoundScan, radio airplay was measured much more evenly. Whether a song was played in a massive city like New York or in a smaller market such as Indianapolis, each station's play counted equally toward a song's chart position. A play was simply a play, regardless of where it happened. According to Mellencamp, everything changed once SoundScan entered the picture. Under the newer system, radio markets were weighted differently. Larger cities with bigger populations suddenly carried much more influence than smaller markets. A song receiving heavy rotation in New York could earn several times more value than the exact same amount of airplay in a Midwestern city. That difference may sound small on paper, but Mellencamp argued that its consequences were enormous. Artists whose audiences were concentrated across America's heartland suddenly found themselves at a disadvantage. Even if they remained extremely popular in places like Indiana, Missouri, Ohio, or other traditional rock strongholds, their chart positions no longer reflected that popularity because those markets contributed fewer points. As Mellencamp saw it, the numbers were now favoring artists who performed well in the nation's largest metropolitan areas. The conversation became even more controversial when discussing which genres benefited from this shift. Mellencamp suggested that many large urban radio stations primarily focused on rap and R&B music during that period. Since those stations operated in highly populated cities, they naturally carried greater influence under the revised chart calculations. He wasn't arguing that rap artists lacked talent. Instead, his point was that the measurement system itself gave those stations greater impact, helping certain genres rise more quickly than others. From his perspective, this wasn't necessarily about musical quality. It was about how success was being measured. Tim White, according to Mellencamp, recognized these consequences almost immediately after the agreement was finalized. He believed the industry would gradually shift toward genres dominating major cities while reducing opportunities for artists whose popularity came from smaller regions. Whether or not that prediction proved completely accurate remains open to debate, but Mellencamp clearly believes the transition marked a turning point. He also recalled another publication called Radio and Records, which competed directly with Billboard. According to him, if Billboard hadn't partnered with SoundScan first, Radio and Records likely would have secured the agreement instead, giving them a significant advantage in the music industry. Regardless of who controlled the technology, Mellencamp believes SoundScan permanently changed the rules of the game. He pointed to something many longtime music fans may remember. There was once a time when nearly everyone knew the #1 song in America. Those hits gradually climbed the charts over several weeks, giving audiences enough time to hear them repeatedly on the radio before reaching the top. Songs seemed to build momentum naturally. Listeners discovered new music alongside friends and coworkers. Week after week, familiar songs continued climbing until they eventually became massive nationwide hits. Mellencamp argued that this slower process helped create stronger connections between artists and audiences. Fans had time to become emotionally invested before a record reached its peak. After SoundScan, however, he believes that gradual rise became much less noticeable. Instead of slowly developing through widespread national exposure, chart success became increasingly influenced by performance in the largest markets. The financial strategies of record labels also changed. According to Mellencamp, companies began concentrating promotional budgets on cities where chart points carried the greatest value. If radio stations in New York, Los Angeles, or other major urban centers could influence chart rankings more than smaller markets, labels naturally invested more resources there. Meanwhile, many traditional rock regions received far less promotional support than before. Whether intentional or simply driven by business decisions, Mellencamp believes these changes slowly weakened rock music's presence across the country. For artists who relied heavily on fans throughout Middle America, the industry suddenly became much harder to navigate. The discussion raises an interesting question. Did SoundScan actually reshape popular music, or did it simply reveal what listeners were already buying and enjoying? Supporters argue that more accurate data allowed charts to better reflect consumer behavior. Critics, however, believe those measurements unintentionally shifted the industry's priorities, rewarding certain markets while reducing attention on others. Either way, Mellencamp's story offers a fascinating glimpse into how one technological change may have altered the direction of modern music. Mellencamp's comments have fueled an ongoing debate among music fans. While some agree that the introduction of SoundScan transformed the industry, others believe it simply exposed trends that had always existed. Whatever the truth may be, there's no denying that the early 1990s marked one of the biggest turning points in modern music history. The commentator examining Mellencamp's interview pointed out that the singer's explanation almost sounded like a theory about how the system unintentionally favored certain genres over others. His interpretation was that larger metropolitan areas suddenly carried much greater influence because of their population size and radio reach. In practical terms, if a song became popular in cities like New York or Los Angeles, it could gain momentum much faster than music that found success in smaller communities. Since record labels naturally wanted the highest possible chart positions, they often concentrated their advertising and promotional budgets where those charts could be influenced the most. That business strategy may have made financial sense, but critics argue it came with unintended consequences. Artists who appealed primarily to listeners across America's heartland often found themselves receiving less support from their labels. Instead of investing equally across the country, companies increasingly focused on markets they believed would generate the strongest chart performance. The commentator connected this idea to the history of several legendary rock bands. Take Kiss, for example. Although the group originated in New York City, they didn't first become superstars there. Instead, they exploded in popularity throughout places like Detroit and other Midwestern cities where rock music had an incredibly passionate fan base. The same pattern could be seen with several other successful artists. Rush, one of Canada's greatest rock bands, benefited enormously after a Cleveland radio station began playing Working Man. That exposure introduced the group to blue-collar audiences who immediately connected with their sound, eventually helping launch their career in the United States. Ted Nugent followed a similar path. While deeply connected to Detroit, he also enjoyed tremendous popularity throughout southern states such as Texas and Georgia. During the 1970s, Nugent sold millions of albums despite not always dominating the biggest urban markets. These examples suggest that many classic rock acts built loyal audiences through regional success rather than relying solely on massive coastal cities. If Mellencamp's theory holds any truth, then changes in chart calculations may have gradually reduced the industry's willingness to invest in those regional fan bases. At the same time, there's another side to the argument. From a record company's perspective, focusing resources on larger population centers isn't necessarily unfair. If an artist performs exceptionally well in New York, Los Angeles, or Chicago, executives may reasonably believe that artist has greater commercial potential than someone whose popularity remains concentrated in much smaller cities. Viewed that way, the shift wasn't necessarily an attack on rock music. It may simply have reflected basic business economics. Supporters of SoundScan often make another important point. Before the system existed, chart rankings relied heavily on estimates and reporting methods that weren't always accurate. SoundScan introduced computerized tracking of actual album sales, giving the industry much more reliable information about what consumers were truly buying. According to many music historians, this improved accuracy actually helped several alternative genres receive long overdue recognition. For example, grunge and alternative rock experienced enormous growth during the early 1990s. Bands such as Nirvana suddenly appeared much higher on the Billboard charts because SoundScan revealed they were selling significantly more records than previous reporting methods had suggested. Rather than creating new popularity, the system may simply have uncovered demand that already existed. That interpretation challenges the idea that SoundScan deliberately hurt rock music. Instead, it suggests the technology provided a clearer picture of changing musical tastes. Still, Mellencamp's perspective remains interesting because he experienced those industry shifts firsthand. As the discussion continued, the commentator wondered whether later genres, particularly nu metal, might also have been influenced by these changing market forces. Bands that blended heavy guitar music with rap vocals became extremely popular during the late 1990s. Groups like Linkin Park, Limp Bizkit, and others successfully combined elements of hip-hop and rock into a completely new sound. Was that musical evolution simply the natural creativity of a new generation? Or were artists adapting to an industry that increasingly rewarded music appealing to both rock audiences and urban radio stations? There's probably no single answer. Music constantly evolves, and every generation develops new influences that reshape popular culture. The commentator then shifted to his own opinions about rock music. He admitted that, personally, he felt the classic era of rock gradually faded after the grunge movement reached its peak. Although he enjoyed some grunge bands during high school, he always considered himself more of a fan of classic rock and pop from earlier decades. That doesn't mean he believes great rock bands disappeared completely. In fact, he acknowledged that many listeners could easily name outstanding rock and metal groups that emerged after the 1990s. However, he questioned whether any achieved the same legendary status as giants from previous generations. This opinion echoes comments made by Gene Simmons, who has argued that truly iconic rock bands have become increasingly rare over the past several decades. Whether fans agree or disagree depends largely on their own musical preferences. Some would point to Pearl Jam, Foo Fighters, Linkin Park, or even newer bands as proof that rock continues to thrive. Others believe no modern group has matched the lasting cultural impact of artists like Led Zeppelin, the Rolling Stones, Pink Floyd, or Nirvana. Ultimately, that's a matter of personal taste rather than objective fact. What makes Mellencamp's interview so fascinating isn't necessarily whether every claim can be proven. Instead, it's that his story opens a larger conversation about how technology, business decisions, and changing consumer habits influence the music people hear every day. Even small changes in chart methodology can create ripple effects that shape radio programming, marketing budgets, artist development, and ultimately the direction of popular culture itself. Whether SoundScan unintentionally accelerated those changes or simply documented them more accurately remains a subject of debate. One thing is certain, however. The music industry of today operates very differently from the one that existed before digital tracking, streaming platforms, and modern analytics transformed the business. For longtime fans of rock music, Mellencamp's reflections provide an intriguing look back at a period when the rules were changing faster than many artists realized. Some listeners may see his explanation as an insider revealing hidden industry mechanics. Others may dismiss it as nostalgia, mixed with speculation. Either way, his perspective encourages music fans to think beyond the songs themselves and consider how behind-the-scenes business decisions often shape what eventually reaches the top of the charts. In the end, the debate continues.